Hello, and thank you for joining us today for another segment of On the Move Conversations with Diverse Women in E-Mobility. I'm Dr. Shelley Francis, co founder of EV Noir. EV Noir is a technology e-mobility consulting organization focused on connected, shared, electric, and autonomous vehicle technology. We focus on two areas of work: e-mobility best practices and e-mobility diversity, equity, and inclusion. This series, brought to you by EV Noir, engages diverse women leaders to share insight about what it's like to work in the e-mobility sector, discuss emerging issues and trends, and provide thoughts on how we can create a pipeline to encourage more young professionals to enter and stay in the sector. Increasing the diversity in this sector is critically important, and let me tell you why. Findings from a 2020 Deloitte study on women in the automotive industry found that although women make up about 80% of decisions around vehicle purchases, we only make up about 30% of employees in this sector. Findings from a 2021 study facilitated by EV Noir found that diverse women, namely African American women, feel ignored in marketing of vehicles. And we also found that in terms of the workplace, women want to see more women in leadership roles in the field. So when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in this sector, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And we at EV Noir are committed to widening the tent and creating a space and opportunities for diverse women to work in this industry. So let's bring on our guest, Dr. Nadia Anderson. Dr. Nadia Anderson has over 10 years of experience working in the e-mobility and clean transportation space. She has spent the last 5 years working in tech and recently accepted a role covering federal affairs for NREX. NREX is a technology company that is focused on making transportation more intelligent via data, insights, and analytics. Wonderful, wonderful. So, Dr. Anderson, welcome to On the Move.
Dr. Francis, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely looking forward to our conversation today.
Absolutely. Very excited to have this discussion with you today. So, as you know, I'm super excited to have you on the series today. And so let's dive into our discussion. So, we both work in e-mobility, and if you're like me, I didn't start off knowing that was the industry or space that I wanted to work in. But all my work experience and education has led me to this space. So, will you tell us about how you got interested in and ended up working in this sector in terms of e-mobility, clean transportation, and what drew you to this work?
No, absolutely. It's an excellent question. You and I are very similar. I too had no idea that the space existed, nor did I know that the skill set that I was sort of cultivating over graduate school and through like summer jobs was actually going to be a fit and was uniquely needed for it. As a person, I've always been curious and always enjoyed learning. So fresh out of graduate school, I got a role at the Auto Alliance, and they had started a new research and technology policy department. So the Auto Alliance was the major trade association that represented all the major auto manufacturers in the US. And that's how I got introduced to transportation and mobility. What I learned very quickly was that there was a lot of room and opportunity within the space. There was a lot happening. At the time, they were talking about, corporate average fuel economy and greenhouse gas regulations. So a lot of chatter was around how do you get electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles out into the ecosystem, and also how do you encourage customers to be interested in these cars and how to buy them. So that was sort of my first entree into the clean mobility tech space. What kept me here is the fact that it's something that I realized was extremely consequential. It's a field and a space that touches everybody every day, and it's also a space that can be extremely impactful depending on what's happening. People feel the change that happens in a manner that is very unique to any other sector. I think the thing that keeps me in this space is the fact that I feel like we're at an inflection point when it comes to the nation's transportation system, but also how people think about transportation, their travel options, mobility, and movement overall. And so I feel like every day there's something new that's popping up, and it's a new area and a new space to sort of dive in. I will also say that it's also a space that's very diverse when you talk about the types of skills that are needed and the types of people who can sort of make a career in there. So I think for me, it was interesting. I fell into it by accident. I've stayed because it's been an ongoing challenge. And I think every time I look up, there's something new that's happening and a new topic that I want to dive into. So that's how I got here and why I stay in the space.
I can totally that resonates with me in terms of there's always something new happening in the space. It's really growing, it's changing every day. And we're almost, I feel, in the nascent stages of the development of this technology and the implementation of it. So speaking of, always something new happening and being challenged by working in this space, tell us about your work and the role that you do in this space or the role that you are playing in this space.
No, absolutely. I think my role is quite unique. So I'm a social scientist by training. I've worked at the public sector, the private sector, and tech with all levels of government, so state, local, federal, international. And I think I bring a policy lens to any role that I bring or any role that I accept. But in addition to that, I also bring the role of being a Black woman in this space. So it's a very unique point of view. So regardless of the title, of the role, of the company, I try to pull from all those experiences into the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. And for me, what is most important is having an impact in some way, shape, or form. So figuring out, how can I make sure that people who aren't represented are being represented? How can I bring a different idea or point of view to a conversation that is, centuries old or decades old, or even very nascent, like you said, sort of starting out? Like, how can I bring a new lens there? I think this also plays a role in how I show up in that space, and regardless of the role that I'm in. So making sure that I am authentic, making sure that I'm, true to myself, but also maintaining that curiosity and asking those questions that sometimes we feel like they're a little bit out of left field, but also diving in to make sure that we can have the impact, that we can have the presence in the communities and cities that we want to serve, but also that we're working to solve some of those hard problems that are out there when we talk about transportation and mobility, and even more present when we talk about transitioning over to clean mobility, so zero emission fuels and vehicles, and making sure that other people have options to travel and move around. So that's sort of me and the role that I take up in this space.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Speaking of being a woman of color in this space and bringing different ideas, different perspectives, and new lenses in terms of looking at the issues and how you show up, how we're represented in the space. What are some of the things that you think would help diverse women have an even more, have a more even playing field in terms of working in the e-mobility sector?
No, that's the $1,000,000 question, so to speak. And for me, it comes down to a numbers game. I think the more women of color who show up in the space, who go after those roles, but also who begin to climb and become leaders within those roles and being able to step out and speak up with their own unique voices, is how you change the space. I think what's most important is that it has to be not only in the managerial roles, but also when you look at people who cover profit and loss lines, people who cover operations, people who are in the marketing comms and the policy spaces as well, and in the engineering spaces too. So making sure that not only are we there, but we're also very spread out throughout the organizations. And I think by nature, it'll become a different type of environment for women, and even more of a different type of environment for women of color, because we tend to think about things differently. We tend to approach problems differently. And we tend to also operate in a manner that is more, I'm going to say, inclusive, for lack of a better word.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that perspective because I can certainly relate to what you shared. I can't talk about or think about my work and my experience in e-mobility without thinking about what it's like to be an African American woman that's working in the space. As I'm sure you're well aware, there are not a lot of us working in the space. And so I definitely feel like we have to support and encourage each other. And respectively, we at EV Noir are working to implement programs both at the K through 12 level and the university level that really addresses the lack of Black and Brown youth going into STEM careers, as well as working in the e-mobility sector. So one of the programs that I'll hone in on is we're facilitating programs that introduces young people as well as young professionals to consider careers in e-mobility. But the challenge is that we're all working in the e-mobility sector. It's super exciting, but like the saying goes, you can't be it if you can't see it. So one of the aims of this show is to let our audience see it. They see you, Dr. Anderson. They see others that we bring to the show who are working in the space and are diverse women leaders. So they see you excelling and continue to be a thought leader in the space. So as we wind down our conversation, what's one piece of advice that you would give to a young person or a young professional who is interested in working in the e-mobility space or interested in transitioning to career opportunities in clean transportation?
Yeah, no, I think that point you made is very, important, and something that really resonates with me as well. Like seeing somebody in the space and also having people who maybe sort of in the limelight and not, public facing, have the opportunity to speak about their experiences, absolutely a way to get more people interested in more exposure to the space overall. I think for any advice I would give to anybody interested in the space is to reach out. So LinkedIn, use your resources. When you go to conferences, figure out who else is there, make those connections, and also ask a ton of questions. So figure out what their path was, because what I've found is that people are very willing to share their stories with you. They're also very willing to help out. And I don't want to call it like official mentoring, but to form like real relationships. I think the other thing too is like people are also willing to take the time to figure out how to cultivate you to be able to step into a space. So figuring out where you may have gaps. I think that if you reach out and ask questions, but also have a lens of being a learner and being open to new experiences and being open to hearing things that you may not have heard before, there's tons of room and opportunity. And I think there are lots of women working in the space who are willing to spend that capital to make sure that you too can enter. And I think that there's also a lot of space for people to come and like chart their own paths as well within this space. As we mentioned earlier, the field itself is changing almost overnight. There's tons of things popping up. And so I think the last piece of advice I would give is to take a little bit of a risk and have a little bit of more of a risk tolerance when it comes to entering into something that may be unknown. I mean, many of you can imagine how the conversation explained to my parents that I was going to go work for the Auto Alliance. And it was questions of, what does that mean? Or what are you doing? And the same conversation happened when I was telling them that I was moving across the country to work for Uber. So what is this? This is the phone app that you're going to work through. I thought you worked in policy, but being able to have the curiosity, but also being able to be in a position to kind of step out there and explore sort of uncharted territory is the advice that I would give to anybody who's interested in coming into the space, and put a finer point on that for women and Black women specifically who are interested in getting into the space.
Wow. Dr. Anderson, I couldn't have said it better myself. The key points that you just stated in terms of what young professionals, young people should be thinking about or considering is networking, and forming real relationships, being curious and using that curiosity to ask questions, be open to new experiences. Hey, take a little bit of a risk, but it's definitely worth it. Both you and I are working and flourishing in the space, and it's because we've done all those things that you just encouraged, other young people and young professionals to consider. So, well, friends, that's all the time that we have today. We definitely want to thank you, Dr. Anderson, for enlightening us and joining us today. We really appreciate your joining us and sharing that wonderful perspective. And we want to wish you well and also encourage you to stay on the move. Thank you and stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you next time.